All right, welcome back to the House Environment Committee. We're going to continue taking testimony on S325 and hear from Billy Coster at the Agency of Natural Resources. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. My name is Billy Coster. I'm the Director of Planning and Policy at the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources. For context, ANR is a statutory party in the Act 250 process, and we provide evidence and recommendations to Act 250 district commissions on many of their criteria, all of the primary and sub environmental criteria. So we review every Act 250 major and minor Act 250 application that gets filed in the state and review them across dozens of different technical programs within our agency and provide written comments to district commissions and participate in hearings for major projects. So we're intimately involved in the Act 250 process, have been for many, many decades, and have been working closely with the LIRB as they work to implement Act 181. So I first want to acknowledge and appreciate the hard work and commitment the LIRB has brought to the implementation of Act 181. LIRB leadership and staff are doing the best they can to manage complex issues on an untenable timeline without the benefit of meaningful public engagement around Tier 3 in the road rule prior to passage of Act 181. The LIRB has been receptive to public feedback and is working to find a path forward for Tier 3. Concept: the new deadlines provided in S325 could provide the time necessary to complete that work. I do want to pause and note here that the new deadlines proposed in S325 closely resemble the implementation timeline the then Natural Resources Board indicated was necessary for successful implementation of Act 181 prior to its passage. Hopefully, this experience will serve as a future reminder to advocates and legislators that new complex things take time, and that time and appropriate resources should be provided or requested by implementing agencies. As I was saying, while S325 could, in concept, provide a path forward with its extended timelines, the proposed date extensions for Tier 3 and the road rule are at this point likely insufficient to remedy the harm caused thus far by the process. Public trust is greatly diminished, and the fallout from Tier 3 and the road rule are beginning to seep into other priority areas for my agency and our efforts to protect natural resources across the state, threatening their long-term success. Therefore, the agency appreciates the value of potentially repealing those sections of Act 181, and if necessary, restarting the public dialogue from the ground up around where, why, and how to increase land use regulations outside of Tier 1 areas to address forest fragmentation. Last week, this committee heard extensive, well-researched, and compelling testimony from Vermonters facing potential impacts from Tier 3 and the road rule. Many of those voices came to Montpelier from our rural communities. They came to this room from communities that support Vermont's 4.5 million acres of forest that represents over 75% of the state's land area. Of that 4.5 million acres, over 3.6 million acres are in private ownership, meaning that 80% of Vermont's forests are owned and maintained by your neighbors and friends. These Vermonters, often for generations, have done the state and the region a great service by keeping our forests healthy and intact. As your witness, Neil Ryan, explained in detail, these are the same folks who are likely to bear the brunt of increased Act 250 regulation under Act 180. In 2022, the Vermont legislature enacted and Governor Scott signed Act 154, an act related to environmental justice. Act 154 establishes an environmental justice state policy that declares, it is the policy of the state of Vermont that no segment of the population of the state should, because of its racial, cultural, or economic makeup, bear a disproportionate share of environmental burdens or be denied an equitable share of environmental benefits. It is further the policy of the state of Vermont to provide the opportunity for meaningful participation of all individuals with particular attention paid to environmental justice focused populations in the development, implementation, and enforcement of any laws, regulation, or policy. Many rural communities have come forward with legitimate questions as to whether this policy has been adequately applied with the implementation of Act 180. The very communities where our forests and significant natural areas thrive have lost trust in the process. Implementation of Tier 3 and the road rule has not moved at the speed of trust for these impacted areas of the state and has instead exacerbated a simmering divide across the state. We're now seeing that lack of trust impact other critical programs. Concerns regarding Tier 3 and the road rule are beginning to undermine support for development of Vermont's 30 by 30 conservation plan. Questions are emerging regarding the role of the use value appraisal program in Tier 3. And recently, a small number of landowners have revoked public access for recreational trails that cross their land in protest to the Tier 3 and road rule provisions of Act 181 and associated process. Additionally, A&R has long valued and relied upon the trust of Vermonters to allow us to explore and investigate unique resources on private land. This trust has enabled a growing catalog of threatened and endangered species and significant natural communities across the state. It has also allowed our Department of Fish and Wildlife to develop, publish, and maintain Vermont Conservation Design, a vision for an ecologically connected landscape in Vermont. The department has been clear and consistent since the inception of VCD that it will not be used as a means to trigger regulatory jurisdiction. That commitment has been critical to its success and wide embrace by Vermonters. With data from VCD increasingly incorporated in Tier 3 mapping, we hope that trust and partnership with Vermonters will hold steady. These concerns are unlikely resolved by a simple extension of dates. As a member of the Tier 3 stakeholder group, the agency is also increasingly finding structural challenges with implementing the critical resource area component envisioned in Act 181. This new jurisdictional class, Tier 3, breaks from Act 250's whole parcel approach and applies only to discrete portions of a parcel and an area of involved land or infrastructure, which is providing challenging to define. Given the permanence of Act 250 jurisdiction, it is unclear how these restrictions will run with the land as structures are modified, removed, or rebuilt in slightly different locations. We're also concerned that with a 2,000-foot trigger for most driveways under the road rule and the current 800-foot buffer for Tier 3 habitat connector areas, that the combination of the road rule and Tier 3 may create the perverse incentive to locate new development between 801 and 1,999 feet from existing roads to avoid Act 250 oversight, rather than to locate that development closer to roadsides, which is by far more preferable location from both an environmental and economic perspective. S325 also authorizes the LURB to waive some or most Act 250 criteria in their review of development triggered by Tier 3 or the road rule. This is confounding. After years of handling Act 250 for its comprehensive, robust consideration of impacts, advocates are now recommending limiting review to as few as one criteria in these areas. Under this framework, whichever criteria ultimately apply in Tier 3 or road rule areas, they are likely to be highly technical, requiring significant input and support from my agency and our staff to Act 250 district commissions to interpret and apply. It's unclear why the state in Tier 3 and road rule areas would require Act 250 review by a lay tribunal with high permit fees to review one or two technical environmental criteria that would be better conducted by a professionally staffed permit program at an administrative agency. All that said, I'd like to end on a positive note. Even without Tier 3 and the road rule, Act 181 expands Act 250's criteria to include consideration of impacts to forest blocks and connecting habitat. This is an important update to address forest fragmentation where review is triggered under existing Act 250 jurisdiction. This is a win for the environment and something A&R and the broader environmental advocacy community has long sought. Additionally, the future land use mapping process, the professionalization of the Land Use Review Board, and the Tier 1A, 1B framework will dramatically improve statewide land use planning, environmental protection, and incentivize growth in the parts of our communities best served to support it. Overall, our agency supports the intent and objectives of Act 181. We see great value in the work that's already underway, but have significant reservations about the substance and overarching implications of how the road rule and Tier 3 are being implemented. So happy to take any questions.
Members have questions. Representative Chapin.
Thanks, Billy. It's great to hear that succinct statement from you. really appreciate that. I have a bunch of questions. I think I'll start with just I think a lot of us are questioning why Act 250 is the right regulatory tool for these particular critical resource areas. We needed to hone in on exactly what those were that weren't already well protected by other programs. And I just, from your perspective, with a suite of different permitting programs within A&R, is there an opportunity to look at other permit programs that could be simply expanded in their jurisdiction as opposed to something so robust and aimed, like there must be permit programs that are aimed at single family home construction level type of construction versus our Act 250 tool, which has been largely aimed at much larger development.
Certainly. So, excuse me, Act 181 in the rulemaking provision for Tier 3 identified a half a dozen resources for the LURB to consider as potentially identifying as critical resource areas. Part of that analysis was to identify if other regulatory programs already or could be adjusted to protect them. Excuse me, very early on in the LURB's process, A&R conducted a gap analysis of those 6, and we found that the only 2 that didn't have meaningful existing programs were habitat connectors and significant natural communities. All the other ones were typically water-based and had some sort of nexus with existing DEC programs, or those programs could be slightly modified to address them. So we didn't, in that process, recommend that Act 250 was the best means to address those gaps. We just provided that information to the LURB. And through their stakeholder process, I think they began with an assumption that Act 250 would be the tool to do that. I think they pulled headwaters in. I think they may be considering dropping those. But they have yet to really, at least in my experience, discuss whether there's other means to get there.
Sorry, whether what?
There's other means to address those gaps in the regulatory framework.
One follow-up, and I'll save some of my other questions for later. So you may have been listening in to our discussion with Laura just now. At the end, we were talking about the Tier 2 report and how that report, it's coming eventually back to us. We might address what do we do if we're not. And my question is really, is the LURB the right entity to make those recommendations? They have the right expertise and process.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
And if not, like who and how?
Right. I think the LURB is an important voice at the table. I don't know that trying to answer that question in the context of a Tier 2 report that's really focused on Act 250's role is the best means to get there. I think it may repeat some of the same missteps that got us to where we are right now. I think they should be part of that conversation, but it likely should be led by a broader group of regulatory agencies that have that full breadth of experience to see what the best tools are. That would be my kind of initial suggestion. I'd certainly think more about it. I do think also the framing of how is Tier 2 working? Are there gaps? Is maybe not ideal either. I think backing up to say, like, what are we actually trying to solve for here? What is the problem? Is it rural sprawl? Is it forest fragmentation? Is there a specific concern that we think is not sufficient, or a gap in our existing system that's not sufficient? And let's get people to weigh in like very broadly at that level. I've been quite involved in development of the climate action plan, 30 by 30 conservation plan. And what we hear consistently from Vermonters, from stakeholders, from advocates is they want to frame the question. They want to be at least at the table when the question is framed. They don't want to enter a conversation where those sideboards have been established to concretely. And, that's a challenge as a regulator, as an administrator, just saying to a group of people, what do we do here? Doesn't necessarily work either. But I think there's a growing body of work that creates pathways for that level of buy-in from the ground up for these sorts of questions.
Representative Tagliavini.
Did I understand you correctly that to help tamp down the level of mistrust and anger at the process, that you think that repeal the road rule in Tier 3 at this point and starting from scratch with that respect to those two is shouldn't be off the table and is probably a good step to take. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
that's correct. I don't know that simply extending the timeline for those processes at this point would be constructive, and that those are the issues that the road rule and tier 3 are trying to address are important ones for our agency. They're concerns that we've shared for a long time around the impact of scattered growth on our environment. So we want to see progress made where necessary and appropriate. So kind of stepping back, taking stock of where we're at and finding a way to move those conversations forward in a more inclusive way would be our recommendation.
Further questions? Representative North?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Billy, for your testimony. So been involved in Act 250 permitting and reviews for a long time. What percentage of Act 250 plans are approved?
My understanding is it's remarkably high, north of 96 or north of 90%, certainly.
So Act 250 doesn't prevent development. It just requires paying lawyers and engineers and experts to complete the application and get through it. Is that true?
In some instances it does. In other instances, I do think that the Act 250 process does potentially put in place conditions and require modifications to projects that either make them impossible to achieve the objective of the landowner or diminish the outcome in some way. So while it's true, Act 250 does not decline a number of applications, it certainly modifies proposals significantly. And often that's for the best, right? You know, at its best, Act 250 is adding value. It's taking something that someone wants to do on their land, in their community, looking at it through a wide range of considerations and bringing resources and information to the table to make it better. But there are certainly instances where that process is restrictive and where issues that are more neighborly and less technical have a bearing on the ultimate outcome of what folks can do.
But even in those cases where modifications are made, the development still ultimately occurs. It just might be moved over here and made a little smaller footprint over there.
Typically, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, there's certainly instances where people don't choose to move forward, but that's a minority.
So it seems to me that Act 250 is completely the wrong tool to use to protect these natural resources when 90% of the time or more, the permits get approved anyhow, just with some modifications. And it's just a matter of money to get through it. What it means is just a massive displacement of people who already own the land because they're likely less fortunate, or, you know, less wealthy from a and they'll just be replaced by wealthier folks who can come in and pay for it all and get through it all and put their maybe a mini McMansion in a place where they would like on that same property.
You know, I would say Act 250 is not entirely dissimilar to other regulatory programs, most of which don't say yes or no. They say do it differently. So I don't think Act 250 is unique in that. You know, our stormwater program, you know, our river corridor program, those are similar reviews where something is proposed, there's a resource that we're concerned about, and we say do it a little differently, and if you're able to, then you're good to go. But those are typically more binary technical analysis. Act 250 introduces a level of discretion and this broad breadth of criteria that is unique, and there's real value in it, but there's also cost and impediment in some instances.
I think we're agreeing.
Yeah.
And but I don't think we're disagreeing, so. Good for analysis, thank you.
Representative Logan?
I would like to, directly respond to what Rep. North said here, and maybe just frame the question a little differently. I mean, I would first like to object to the statement that just having money means you're going to be able to do projects that'll harm natural resources. And you'll get an Act 250 permit. I think what we're hearing is that going through the Act 250 permitting process or any of a number of other permitting processes means that you substantively change the project in a way that it protects the natural resources in question. So it's more of a consultation process that results in an approval of development that doesn't, harm the rest of us. in the process, because that's what we're really talking about. Like the limitation on what somebody can do on their property should be whether or not it harms other people. And we're talking about resources that are crucial to the survival of humanity. And so it's really important that we have a policy that gets it right. Especially as we're looking like 2 and 3 decades out. When we can't replace resources, once they're lost, and we're gonna need to sustain the life of a lot more human beings in Vermont, probably in 2 or 3 decades than we are right now, due to climate change, migration. And so I think it's, I think I'm a little resistant to just entirely giving up on tier 3 or the road rule without having some plan in place to achieve the same policy outcomes. And I think it's our responsibility to do it. And I guess my question is, like, because you've done the gap analysis and recognize that there are these, there are no permits that can deal with forest fragmentation and critical resources. Like, why wouldn't Act 250 be a good, I know it's an unusual way to use Act 250, but why, it's a development review process. And we recognize the usefulness of Act 250 is primarily due to the lack of capacity at the municipal level to do regulation on site in the way that like better resource municipalities can do, because they have their own staff. But I'm curious, like, why is that not, like I said, it's an unusual path to take for Act 250 because it isn't on the parcel level, but like, why couldn't we find some way to manage the development review process through Act 250 in a way that has a similar result? And I also think what we're hearing through public feedback too. So just before I ask that actual question, I think what we're also hearing in terms of public feedback is a lot of complaints about other permitting processes. Actually, people say like, well, Act 250 means I can't build, like, we can't build a house on this property, and then you find out it's actually a wastewater permit that's holding them up, but they think it's Act 250. So it does seem to me like there's like a complexity to our permitting process around really, really crucial natural resources that is making it difficult for like a normal person to navigate, a person without a ton of resources. And like, I'm curious about how we make this entire process simpler, and Act 250 has the benefit of being more holistic in the first place. And it seems like that's what people are looking for, is a place where they can go, like one place where they can go to deal with all of these development issues on their own property, which is aside from the question of whether or not we should be telling people that they can or can't do something on their property. But I think that's a legitimate thing to do when it has a huge human impact off that property. But yeah, so what are your thoughts about
So
why not Act 250?
yeah, a few answers. I would say, I don't think that it's impossible or completely inappropriate to use Act 250 to address some of the current concerns that you've articulated. I think my concern with the specific approach using it now with the road rule in tier 3 is that, as you heard last week, there's just, based on facts or fiction, there's a dynamic in the state right now that's going to make that conversation very difficult and productive. So I'm saying, let's take a step back and assess. So it may be through that reassessment, Act 250 emerges as one of the tools we use to address whatever problem statement we identify. I think the other reason why Act 250 would be unusual to use in this instance is because of a couple of factors. Its comprehensive nature and its permanence. When Act 250 jurisdiction is triggered on the parcel for most forms of development, it's there forever. So any activity that occurs in the future on that property that's a material change, a substantive change, requires going back to a district commission, getting an amendment. And that's unique to, I think, any other permit I can think of. And typically, regulation addresses the impacts at the time of construction or the operation of it, right? And the operational permits need to be, amended or updated from time to time. And those other permits are often referred to as media permits, and that they focus on a very specific issue. And it's usually a fairly technical, ideally binary analysis. You have X amount of earth disturbance, so you need Y permit. You've got this much of an impact on a resource, you do or you don't need a permit. Act 250, both by the nature of their criteria, which is much more qualitative, opens it up to a lot more discretion and interpretation. And then the breadth of criteria just, it's both its value. If you're looking at a major development in your community, you want to know if it's impacting municipal services and consistent with the town plan. If you're looking at, one house in one place, that breadth of criteria may not be necessary. So I think that's the big distinction, the permanence, the overarching nature. It's really developed as a tool for big things. And many of these impacts to these critical resources and fragmenting impacts to forests are not big things. They can be small things with an outsized impact that traditionally media permit programs are more adept at addressing. It's not to say either or, it's just that's the reality of how we've typically done stuff.
Question. So just a follow-up question on that. It sounds to me like we need to have a fairly intensive conversation with Vermonters about their property and their communities and how to achieve our policy goals around preservation of our natural resources for the sake of all of us. And I'm curious, I think one of the things that we struggled over when talking about Act 181 was making sure that there were adequate resources available to do that engagement. And I did not feel like we had the support of the administration to put those resources into process. And I'm curious if the administration would support or has the resources itself to conduct public process around these issues that we are surfacing, or would support us, making some appropriations to be able to have the land use review board hire a consultant or have the Agency of Natural Resources lead a process out or something like that.
Yeah, fair question. And I don't know the answer to that. I'm certainly happy to get that for you or have someone higher up in the administration come in and speak to it. But yeah, this sort of engagement is resource intensive. And I think even when we've really done a good job of it, we haven't entirely hit the mark. And I know with the Global Warming Solutions Act, it has a provision that requires an enhanced level of public engagement beyond most rulemaking processes. And we have dedicated staff people at both my agency and at the Public Service Department that are focused on outreach and communication. They go to non-traditional communities. They go to where people are gathering. They go at night. They go to farmers markets. They do a tremendous amount of work getting to places where they can access folks that aren't often at tables like these and bringing information to them and getting their ideas. And it's a tremendous endeavor. So they do a great job of it. I think that model could certainly be replicated for these sorts of land use conversations. I don't know off the top of my head what the resource requirements would be, but they're not insignificant.
I think I know the answer to this, but I just want to make sure before I ask a follow-up. Have you been involved in rulemaking processes in your time at A&R?
I have not. I haven't led them. I've participated in them.
Yeah. So I guess I'm curious, as a member of the stakeholder group, the relationship between the stakeholder group and the LURB and what your advice was. We've heard from other stakeholders. I'm curious what yours was in this, kind of how the approach they took to providing maps and information on Tier 3 and the road rule and the way it was rolled out.
Yeah, I think, thank you for that question. I think Tier 3 was unique in that the kind of first step of the rulemaking process was to identify what resources the rule would apply to. And I think that's somewhat unique. Usually the rulemakings I've been involved with the statute is more prescriptive about, what the standard is. And then the rule is more of like an implementation document. And, I certainly recall during the Act 181 process, there was a lot of conversation about like what should be a critical resource area. Is this something we can legislate? Is this something that needs further work? And I think the LURB is still struggling with that. It's just a really hard question to say, what are these places on the landscape that are so unique and important that they need this added level of protection? I frankly thought it might be easier to come to that place, and it hasn't been. So, our advice to the LURB was to start small, to really try to focus on areas where there's true gaps, and then build from there. And I think they did that to some extent. I think it's hard when you acknowledge that we have connecting habitat that's really important all over the state, and to look at that seriously, you have to start with somewhat of a wide lens. But I think they've been doing the best that they can. I think there may have been value in pausing longer and engaging the public more thoroughly before subsequent drafts of maps and rules came out, but they were on a timeline to meet the existing deadlines, which were pretty demanding. So I don't think that they necessarily had the time to do that work. They certainly did, at least one round of pretty significant statewide public engagement. They've been to all the regions, they're doing the work, but I think for something this magnitude, just having a little bit more space to, before deciding things, go out to folks with those conversations. And as you all know, whenever you put something on a map, you've lost control of it. So that's a really hard thing with these conversations when you're dealing with place-based, map-based decisions. You can put all the caveats in the world that you want on a map, but when people see them, they interpret it in the way that they're going to interpret it. And it's really hard to stay ahead of that.
Yeah, and I guess it's specifically, I'm curious if there were ecologists involved or how they were involved in the thoughts behind the corridors. That seems to be one of the biggest things that overwhelms people. And to show a map with folks' houses in it, existing developments, and I mean, I actually pose this not so much because I want to go backwards, but when I thought of wildlife corridors as a resource there, I was thinking of like the top 7 or 10, not the whole state, and then to put a buffer around that corresponded to the road rule numbers seemed also like, where did that decision come from? And how did that get even kind of put on the table?
Yeah, I don't remember like precisely, but we identified habitat connectors as a gap. We suggested that the Vermont Conservation Design highest priority habitat blocks would be a good baseline for the conversation. Those are, in the broadest sense, significant habitat connectors statewide. And then really encourage the stakeholder group to figure out how they want to refine from there. The ecologists in our agency were reluctant to prioritize beyond VCD. They felt that the entire network is important for a connected ecological landscape. I think when the LURB had questions and suggestions, we engaged with them, but it was really the LURB board members who drove how to use that underlying VCD data to come up with the various iterations that they had. There were other ecologists on the group. I'm trying to remember, I believe folks from the Vermont Center for Ecologic Studies was on it. I think Eric and Liz may have been. I've been in so many stakeholder groups, I forget, but there was other ecological representatives beyond our agency. Vermont Audubon was there. At one point I provided some of the stakeholders a copy of the Vermont Conservation Design gap analysis we did for the Act 59 process, the conservation planning process, that showed where, there was gaps in conservation, and that identified, I think, 10 regionally significant wildlife corridors in the state. I provided that as a reference if folks wanted to kind of narrow in that way. I know I think we offered the Staying Connected initiative as another resource. So There's certainly groups and expertise in the state who have taken that statewide network and said, these are the top 7, 10 places to focus. Why that concept wasn't embraced by the steering committee, I don't know.
Members have other questions, Representative Labor.
Thank you. You for testifying. I come from the most economically depressed rural area of the state. 12 towns and 3 gores. And altogether, you get to 4,609 people. That said, actually, I ran out of space on the iPad to save all of the emails that I got regarding Tier 3 and the road. It's primarily ag and forestry. There are very few industries other than Columbia Forest Products. Your educational systems, they're probably the biggest employers. And I only know of half a dozen loggers spread out through that whole area. A lot of them now are crossing the river to New Hampshire because there's less restrictive regulations. I may be misinformed, but it was my understanding that we were trying to improve our lack of housing and make it more affordable and more reasonable. I think there was a good attempt to do that. But the interpretation by over 500 people on our Capitol steps and 1 protest demonstration, plus all the emails, out of several hundred emails, I only have 2 that come from my district. Over 90% come from much further south, like Route 4 across the state and below. A lot of that is Chittenden County. I understand that. And I think that's a good thing. Maybe that'll loosen up some housing on the Tier 1s. But in our area, there's some 3 to 5 generations that own the same plot of land and forest. It's very hard for them to get to just even imagine being told what they can and can't do for their grandchild or child on their own land, keep them close to home for adult support in their senior years and to perpetuate the farm and forest ecology. There are no, in my estimation, there is no better conservation than a farmer and a forestry owner. So I believe you are right on. 3, Tier 3, and the road rule nonsense. My own driveway's 2,000. It's 1 mile long.
Thank you for that. I did try to acknowledge in my testimony the important role that our private farm and forest landowners have played in keeping Vermont forested in the way that it has. And I agree with you. Those folks, need to be part of this conversation from the ground up. I do also want to acknowledge that we've been very fortunate to be able to keep what we've had, and that may persist for some time. But there's going to be a point in the future where we're going to probably see some additional pressures on our landscape. So I think this is not a conversation that should, go away and never come back. I think we should have a rational, inclusive conversation about what problems we may face in the future from additional development pressure in different parts of the state, and how we get ahead of those in a way that is responsive and respectful for the folks in your district and all around the state. Because I think there's a real shared love of Vermont. And I think everyone would agree that we want to try to keep our economy vital, keep families here, and protect our environment. And I think right now we're disagreeing about how to do that rather than whether that's a shared goal. So I just think trying to reset and make sure that we can do that in a way that is constructive, it would be a great objective for the coming years.
All right, thanks for your testimony. Do you have a question? Representative Voss?
Yep. So, I don't know if you've read the futures report or not, but it talks about how Vermont will need to build 40,000 houses, by 2030. No one's moving here. I think our population increase is 0.03. I think it's one of the lowest growing states in the country. We have the lowest birth rate in the country and the oldest demographic in the country. And so that would equate to, I think, around, I don't know, 8,000 houses a year or something like that. So I always saw 181 as a housing bill, a bill that, along with lowering healthcare, dealing with education, would make Vermont affordable. It was kind of like a solution to me, this three-pronged approach. Can you see how we can get that housing built and still preserve, our most precious and irreplaceable natural environments?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on this issue, but I think the work that Act 191 does to incentivize growth in our existing communities and areas that have infrastructure and where, we've traditionally seen our villages and downtowns and broader communities, making it easier to grow in those places so that we can get those units faster and more affordably in places where it makes sense, I think is something that Act 181 is already doing. The Home Act, the interim exemptions, we're seeing real benefits from that. My hope is that the future land use planning that the regions are doing to help identify not just those, traditional downtowns and village centers, but the kind of areas of future growth around them, and put the tools in place to promote density in those places will hopefully help with that as well. And then I think there's a piece that isn't part of Act 181, but really trying to maintain a robust farm and forest economy and recreation economy in the rural parts of our state. Those are the engines that kept those communities alive for many generations and have kept keeping intact forests economically feasible for private citizens in Vermont. So the more we can do to kind of support and innovate in those spaces so that, farms can stay farms, forests can stay forests, that will hopefully protect those resources through market forces. And then to have this broader conversation about, what are the risks to our environment going forward and what are the best ways to address that in a way that works for as many Vermonters as possible.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for your testimony.
Thank you for the time.
Thank you.
Shall we take a break until 3:30 and come back for discussions?